So for this video, I'm going to show you how to make a soldered band ring with a bezel set cabochon. So the first thing I've done is designed my ring. So this is my vision of a ring. You could do something similar if you wanted to, but I recommend taking notes on this video just like I have notes here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I need to identify the different metal pieces that I'm going to put together for my ring based on my cabochon. So I've decided on this clear cabochon as my focal point for my ring, and then I wanted to make it out of copper, unlike my last video where I did a mix of copper and brass. So I want a thick band, thick copper wire. I need a copper bezel to go around my cabochon, and then I need a back plate to keep my cabochon together. So very much like the last video, I'm going to make my pieces out of watercolor paper first, measuring them to size so that when I cut them out of metal, they match. I will need 3 pieces. I need a back plate for my cabochon to sit on. I will need a band that will wrap around my ring finger, and you can decide which finger you want. And then I have a bezel that is going to hold my cabochon in place against that back plate. So just like that first video, I measure the bezel around my stone, making sure it's nice and tight and the proper height or width to hold my stone. So I'm keeping those all together. You could make a different band like this one. I chose to use a thick wire for the band, but you can make it out of flat metal. You could also choose a different backplate design for your stone. I'm trying to keep mine as simple as possible, but there are tons of options in terms of design. So this is just one way. This is my solution, but definitely think about what you want. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is measure the ring for the size finger that you want. So this is a ring sizer, and it has different size numbers on it. We're going to look at the whole number side, not the decimal side. And these whole numbers have little dashes next to them, and that just means they're in between sizes. So I know that I want to make a size 8 for my finger, and I'm trying to find the proper size, but if you don't know, you can just try on a bunch of these different ring sizers to see what fits you. So I found the one I wanted, and I want my size to be snug but not too tight and then not too loose. So definitely go through the ring sizer and find something that is comfortable for you as your ring. Next, I'm going to take this ring mandrel, which is kind of like the bracelet mandrel but thinner, and it's made out of steel, and I'm going to put my ring sizer on the mandrel. The mandrel also has numbers on it. Sometimes these numbers are not accurate, so we'd like to put the ring sizer on top of the ring mandrel just to be sure. So it says 8, it's lined up, goes down as far as it possibly can. So now that I know my size on the mandrel matches the ring sizer, I'm able to measure my piece of paper. I'm going to use a vise on the table to hold my mandrel, and this is optional. I just like some stability. And then I'm going to take a scrap piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to wrap the scrap piece of watercolor paper around the size that I have measured on my mandrel. And just sort of like the cabochon, I want my band to line up. So I cut my paper a little bit longer than I needed because I'm going to take a Sharpie marker and then make a mark where those two ends meet. This is a lot easier to make out of paper first. That's why I suggest it as opposed to metal. So then I cut my paper to the length that I need, knowing that that is the length of the band to fit around my finger perfectly. Now the width is totally up to you. In my case, I'm using a wire, so the wire width that I have, I'm going to form later. I'm labeling this band and size 8. Just for later, I know that I need this scrap piece of paper to measure my metal. The next thing that I'm going to do is I want to make my back plate. You notice that my cabochon is round, but my back plate is a rectangle. That is purposeful because we are going to create a bezel that will be soldered onto the back plate that we will file and flex shaft so that it is flush together. Now this is an option for you. You don't have to do it like me, but I wanted to show you a professional looking ring. So the first thing I do, like my last video, is I trace around my cabochon. And again, you don't need to do this in Sharpie. You could do this in pencil if you want to, but you need an accurate size for your cabochon. And this is just on watercolor paper. So then I take it and I am going to give myself a little bit of space and draw a rectangle around it. And again, you need space because your bezel is going to be soldered onto that back plate. So don't be too close to the bezel. And there is my back plate, so I can cut that out and use that to measure my metal sheet. The last piece of metal I will need is my actual bezel. So that's going to wrap around my cabochon like before. So you want your paper to be the correct width and the correct length to fit your stone snugly inside of it. So in my last video I used a brass sheet metal. In this case I'm going to be using copper to keep the consistent metal in my ring because that is part of my design. So just a reminder, you take a scrap piece of paper, you wrap it around your cabochon tightly, giving yourself a little bit extra paper to get that perfect seam. And I always measure the length first, or what fits tightly around the cabochon, before I do the height or the width of the cabochon. So making a little mark, and then I'm going to cut it out with my scissors. And you want your stone, again, to be higher than your bezel, because once we squeeze your bezel around your stone, you don't want that metal to cover up the focal point of your ring. So I'm going to cut about half off this piece of paper to start. And you can always go slow and just cut little bits off at a time until you get the size that you need. But it's so much easier to do it in paper first and have those measurements than accidentally cut too much or not enough in metal. So I'm remeasuring, constantly making sure that it is where I want it. Once I'm satisfied with that on paper, I label it again because I don't want to confuse it with my band. And I have all my paper for measuring and cutting out my metal pieces. All right, so once I have all my paper, I cut these things out of metal. So that is my backplate, just out of a sheet of copper. And my stone will fit on it like so. I have my band, which again I'm using a thick copper wire. And you can choose if you want it to be sheet metal or wire. And then this is for my bezel. Now I will have to cut a little bit off of that bezel to make it the right length. But I have my 3 pieces of metal to make my ring. So this part I'm just going to go quickly. I'm going to show you how I measure the height of the bezel again, and give you a little bit of a visual as to what your stone should look like. But I am using a ruler to make a nice straight line that I will cut with my jeweler's saw. And I have marked the spot that I don't want with X's. So your stone should look something like this from the side, if it's like mine. So that is my cabochon from the side. It's flat on one side and then round on the other. And that is going to sit up against the back plate. And my bezel should be about right here, where the curve of that stone is visible, but the edges of the bezel stick out a little bit more to be pushed in. And this is really important, again, to make sure that your stone doesn't fall out. Okay, so now that I've done that, step number 1, I'm going to move on to step number 2, which I'm going to solder the seam of my bezel. So because I'm using a thicker copper sheet, I'm going to use a pliers to bend these 2 ends together. And just like the other video, you want to make sure that your seam is solid and that there are no gaps. And the shape of your bezel doesn't need to match the shape of your cabochon just yet, because we still have to solder them so it's more stable and file them so that there are no uneven lines. I'm filing my ends just a little bit to make sure they meet perfectly. And then bending them to touch. And depending on how thick your bezel is, this could take a couple minutes, or it could take no time at all. So my last video, my bezel was pretty thin, but this one's a little bit thicker and a little bit hardier. So I want to make sure that I am keeping everything nice and flat and even for my solder to flow. Okay, so once I have it sort of like in a semicircle shape with that seam touching, I am going to go over to my soldering station and I'm going to put it on the third hand, which is on top of the tripod so I can see my seam at eye level. And again, you want the seam to be the lowest point because gravity is going to allow that solder to flow in the seam to bind it. So I'm going to take a little bit of flux, paint it right on that seam, and then I'm going to take hard solder. So if you find hard solder again in sheets, you're going to have to cut some pieces for yourself. Now we only need one piece of hard solder for our seam, but we are going to use hard solder later for our back plate. So I'm just going to cut a few extra pieces. So remember, when you cut, you want to cut it up first and then horizontally to cut more pieces. Okay, so now I'm going to take my tweezers and I'm going to very carefully put one piece of hard solder right on the seam, and I put my bowl right underneath just in case that solder falls. I'm not wasting it. And for this part, you are going to be using a medium torch. I don't recommend using a large torch for your bezel. You don't want to melt it. But sometimes your metal is a little bit too thick for the smallest torch. So this is a 180-0 that I'm using. Again, it's a medium torch. So as always, I'm going to turn on my torch. And then I'm going to start from the top or the bottom a little bit just to get that flux white and crusty. Staying far away from that blue cone tip to start. I'm just giving it a little bit of heat at a time. Moving my flame. Making sure that that flux keeps that piece of solder in one place. So then I can go from the bottom and watch my piece of solder. And you are going to anneal it, so watch your metal. You don't want it to melt, but it will get red hot. And I should say you don't want your metal to melt, but you do want the solder to melt. So that silvery seam will show up, and that's how you know that your bezel is connected. So then I like to dunk my entire third hand again into the water. I double check to make sure it's not hot. And then I test my seam by giving it a little tug and hoping it doesn't come apart. So now to get rid of the fire scale, I put it in the regular pickle because it is just copper. And then I wait about 5 minutes and come back and check on it. Alright, so my bezel is nice and clean. I rinsed it from the pickle. There is some solder still on it, but we will clean it up later. I test it to fit around my stone, so you might have to do some adjusting with pliers. And I make sure that everything works with my back plate. So you might need to play around a little bit just to get that right shape and that right size. But if your bezel is still too tall for your stone, like mine was still too tall, I put my stone inside of it, and I take a thin Sharpie, and I measure just the excess on the edge that I need to cut off. I turn my stone, going all the way around, giving myself a measurement that I know I have to file off. So for this, you could use a flex shaft, or you could hand file it. I like to hand file it because I get a little bit more control and more evenness. But once it is filed and it is nice and flat, and I even filed a little bit of that solder off, you are now able to solder your bezel to that back plate like we did in the other video. So again, you want to make sure that your bezel fits around your stone at this point because it's hard to fix if it doesn't. And then we are going to go to our soldering station and solder that bezel to the back plate. You always want to make sure that your back plate is clean and that your bezel is clean as well. So I give it just a little bit of sand to get some of that fire scale and that dirt off. And again, just double check that it is nice and flat and that there are no gaps. So now we are soldering. We're putting our flux on the back plate, putting it on the tripod to heat it from below. I'm again going to take hard solder and put it on the inside of my bezel and push it up against where that bezel and the backplate meet. Again, you don't want solder directly in the middle of this because it could be lumpy and your stone won't sit nicely. And because my stone is transparent, you will definitely see the blobby solder underneath it. So I'm trying to eliminate having to clean up a lot of the solder from the seam. So it does take a little bit of patience and a little bit of time. And I am using hard solder because I know that my bezel is pretty thick and my backplate is pretty thick and I want everything to stick together. So I'm using a 180-0 torch, which is medium, going from the bottom. And every once in a while I take the heat off and move my tweezers to make sure that my solder doesn't jump too far from the place I want it to melt. So I'm moving my heat constantly, watching the flux get nice and crusty. Taking an extra tweezers in my hand so when the solder starts to flow and turn red hot, I can push down my bezel so that there are no gaps in the seam. You want a nice, solid, silvery seam. Okay, so it's stuck, everything is soldered, and now I have to pickle it. All right, once it is out of the pickle, I haven't done too much cleaning just yet, but I do want to cut off that excess plate because I don't need it. I don't want my plate to be square. I want it to fit perfectly against my bezel. So this can get a bit tricky because your metal has been annealed, so it's a little bit soft. But I'm going to cut around, trying to cut as accurately as possible, but I can always go back and file it so that it meets, and I will file it so that it is nice and flush. And the reason I didn't clean up my solder is because it would have been a waste of time to try to clean up the outside and then just get rid of that metal anyway. So I'm being careful not to bend my bezel too much or to break a bunch of blades. And this is optional for you. If you want to leave your backplate as a square, because that's part of your design, you can, or a rectangle. If you want to cut your backplate into a different design, you absolutely can. But I liked the round oval shape. All right, once all my metal is cut off, I now can file it so that the edges meet. And this is also nice because it'll clean up any solder that's left over. You do want to make sure if you are doing this technique that everything is connected by solder. You don't want any more gaps because it could potentially ruin your design. So that will take a little bit of time. Okay, so now back to my plan. I'm going to make my band for my finger. So I am taking this thick wire, and you could leave it as is, but I want to do something called forging. And forging is like what blacksmiths do when they are making tools or armor or things like that. So first thing is I'm going to file the edges. I have cut this wire with a jeweler's saw because my wire cutters are not big enough for this wire. It's very thick and hard to cut through. So again, I have measured it using the piece of paper that I measured around my finger with the ring sizer. And now I'm going to do something with annealing. So because this wire is super thick and sturdy, I am going to use a 180-1 torch tip, or the biggest torch tip. And I want to get it red hot so that it is nice and soft and flexible for me to manipulate it and to make it flatter. So remember when you are annealing that you want your piece of metal to get red hot, and you want that blue cone tip to touch the metal. And I don't suggest doing this with very thin metal because you can melt it. But this wire, as you can see, needs a lot of heat because it is so dense. And I want both ends to be flattened. So I got both ends red hot, and then I'm going to quench it in the water. You could pickle it at this point, but you don't really need to because if you are doing a lot of hitting with a hammer and forming and forging, you're going to have to anneal several times. So I put it in the pickle just to show you. I'm going to go and rinse off that extra chemical. And then after I rinse it, I can dry it, and then I can do the forging aspect of my band. And again, this is optional, but it is a nice touch and a more advanced way to create your metalwork or your ring. So I've dried it off with a paper towel, and now I have a steel block, and I'm going to use a ball peen hammer, the flat side, to shape and manipulate the ends of my metal how I wanted them to be in my design. So they're going to fan out sort of like a fin, hitting it from both sides, getting it nice and flat. And this is also going to be attached to the back side of my cabochon, that back plate. So the flatter it is, the better chance that the solder is going to flow. For this, if you want to tape down your metal, you definitely can, so it's not moving a lot. But you're going to notice that as you are hitting it with a hammer, if you are forging, it's going to become harder and harder to get flat. It likes to toughen up as you manipulate it more. So I am using a pliers to sort of bend it into the shape of the ring, but then I can use the ring mandrel and hit it with a mallet or a ball peen hammer to do more adjusting. But I will have to anneal it again, just because I want it to be a little bit more soft, so I'm not doing a ton of work trying to bend it with my fingers, because that doesn't feel good. So in total, I've annealed this piece twice for this project. Sometimes, depending on the metal, you might have to anneal it some more. So I've gotten my piece red hot, softening it up, dunking it in the water, and I'm not going to pickle it this time, but I am going to just dry it a little bit with the paper towel. And now it should be much softer. See how I can bend it with my fingers? And I'm going to hit it around the 8, or the part of the ring mandrel that I want to be sized around the finger. I do try it on just to make sure that the size on the mandrel is matching my actual finger. If you're making a ring for another person, you might just have to trust the mandrel or the ring sizer, as you might not have that person there available to you to measure. So once I have a band that is the correct size, I am then able to pickle it, because there is fire scale still on the band, and I don't want that to be something that's going to interfere with my soldering of the back plate. But you want to do as much adjusting as you can before you solder that back plate on. So be a little bit picky with your design, and make sure that everything is how you want it, because it's, again, easier to do it before you solder. So now I am going to, after I've pickled the band, I'm going to melt some solder right on the seam where I want it to stick to that back plate. So this is like the sweat soldering part of this project. I'm going to be using hard solder, because again, I want to make sure that nothing comes apart. And I'm going to be using a medium torch. So I put one piece of hard solder on the seam of the band, starting far away, watching that flux bubble up and get crusty. And I'm just putting one piece of solder, but sometimes, depending on the back of your band, you might want more. And it's much easier at this point to put solder on the band, because then you won't have to clean up so much solder on the back piece of your cabochon. Okay, so I dunk it in the water to quench it, and now I have to pickle it again to make sure it's nice and clean. But once I have everything set up and together, I am now able to construct the rest of my ring. So I'm going to use the third hand, and I am going to take my band and place it down against the back plate. So my bezel is against the charcoal block, and I am layering the metal together, making sure that there are no gaps, because at this point you want to construct your entire ring, so you don't want it to be uneven, and you want that solder to flow. So I'm just putting flux in between, because I've already melted that solder on the band itself, and I'm going to heat it up so that gravity is going to allow that solder to reactivate and flow down onto the band. So I've already cleaned my metal, I've pickled it, I've sanded it, and now it is ready to be heated up and stuck together. So again, no gaps, no gaps. Okay, so for this, I am using a medium torch again. I've been using it the whole time, so 180-0. And I'm just heating up that flux to be nice and crusty. And I always want to make sure that I'm not bumping my metal, because at this point it could bump and then you would solder it incorrectly. So I'm aiming my blue cone tip after the flux calms down a little bit. I'm aiming it right at that seam, and I'm watching both pieces of metal to turn red hot and anneal. I have a tweezers ready to just give my band a little push once it's red hot so that solder sticks to the back plate. It does take a little bit of time because you're going through several layers of metal, so you want to be aware of things getting extra hot. Alright, so once my seam has soldered, you might see a little silver right on the edge. I let my ring just cool down for about a second or two, and hopefully if you lift up by the base, be extra careful of course, it does not fall off. So now I'm able to take it off, and obviously it's very dirty with fire scale, but it's sticking, which is great. So I'm going to pickle the entire thing because it's copper. And then after it's pickled, I can do more filing and forming and shaping. So before this, I have grinded down all the excess solder with the flex shaft. Because once you set your stone, you can really only sand it and polish it. You shouldn't be going to the flex shaft. So just like setting a stone in the other video, I'm using the pusher. And I am putting this in a vise just to give myself a little bit more free hands than my last one. Remember using the flat pusher from the Bezel Set Stone Supply Kit, and you're pushing at opposite levels to bend the edges of that bezel over the top of your stone. Now my bezel in this video is a little bit thicker than the other one, so the support of the vise is very helpful. You don't want to tighten it too much and dent your metal, but just enough to keep it stable. You could also use a ring clamp for this from the Back Metals Lab if you don't have a vise. So I'm looking to get all the wrinkles out and to close up all the gaps. And I am using my thumb or my opposite hand to keep down that bezel and keep the stone nice and flat up against the back piece. I don't want gaps or my stone to fall out as I'm pushing. So I'm doing a lot of the brunt of the work with this pusher tool, the flat steeled part. And like I said, my bezel is, in this case, much thicker than my other one, so I have to use a lot more force to get it to close. I'm going around and around as well, making sure it's nice and even. And then I'm going to take my rocker, again if I have some wrinkles or things that just aren't sitting quite right, going over the edges. Rolling it against it. And then my last tool is my burnisher, just to get those top portions of the bezel over the stone. And it's sort of like you're whittling, taking the flat edge and making sure all those gaps are gone. Now obviously you want to be careful of your cabochon. You don't want it to scratch it at this point. Some people like to put tape on top of it. But I've found if I keep my finger sort of over it, that the tools will run into my finger before they run into the stone itself. So just be aware of that as you are closing up your bezel. Alright, so once my stone is set and doesn't fall out, I am now able to sand it and polish it to a mirror shine. So this is my mirror shine. You want to be careful not to get polish on the stone itself, but you can use the wooden clamp to hold it, using a polishing cloth to get all the excess off. And this is your completed ring. Professional, shiny, beautiful, no excess solder, done. So good luck with your project. Hopefully you make a really cool ring like I did and you're super satisfied.